Turn with me this morning to Revelation chapter 15. Needing to send this to several people in our that takes our CDs, and I thought we would discuss it. We've probably had a study on similar to this before, but what I'm thinking about is the New Jerusalem, and we need to see some characteristics of this, where it is and what's taking place in the New Jerusalem at this time. And also one of the things we want to notice is that there's an interchangeable word here, and it's sea of glass. And we'll see how that New Jerusalem and sea of glass are the same when we read about it in the Scriptures and see its definition and its description. Then what John calls here the sea of glass, he also calls the New Jerusalem. But it's not until Revelation that it's referred to as the sea of glass. In the Old Testament, the New Jerusalem was considered a place of protection, future protection for future spiritualness would be there for it. Then when we come to the New Testament, we learn the words New Jerusalem and Holy Jerusalem, and that being separate from the earthly Jerusalem. And I stress that because there are some people today, some denominations, teaching that there is no such thing as the New Jerusalem, that word means a new renovation of the Jerusalem that's on earth. And that in time in the future, God will just, they call it rejuvenate old Jerusalem on earth to where it will then be called the New Jerusalem. But we'll see that's not true at all. We'll see that New Jerusalem is actually in heaven and will come down from heaven for us. So to pick up on a few of these thoughts here then. Revelation 15, starting with verse 1. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. And I saw as it were a sea of glass, mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. And they sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty, just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. So we start out by seeing here people, and we see these people standing in a particular place. And verse 3 says, it's on a sea of glass. Now, I think of a sea of glass, it's like we would say of people if we were at a large gathering that was maybe in a big park, and we say we looked out over the sea of people. In other words, it's just a large area made up of people there. Well, here, he's seeing a very large area, and this very large area is glass. It's like clear as crystal. So he says, I see these people standing on that sea of glass. Now, the words there, fill up. And it talks about to stand on there with a sea of glass, and it fills up this area. And that comes from a word in the Greek called teleo, teleo. And what that means is to make an end to, or to finish, to make something like to expire. So he says, whenever this takes place, it is a time of expiration. And that's in the verse 1. He's talking about the sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for them is filled up the wrath of God. And that's what this word is referring to. It is a time of expiration of something. It's the expiration of the wrath of God. wrath of God will be taking place through these 7 last plagues. But I'm just saying this is a scene that John is seeing in in a vision, and calls it that sea of glass, and then just tells us a few things that he sees there. And one of them is these 7 angels prepared to pour out their plagues. Another thing he sees is in verse 3. There's 2 songs to be sung there. One song, he says, is the song of Moses. The other song is the song of the Lamb. In trying to think about these, I look back in the Old Testament, and the song of Moses was like a song celebrating God's getting them release from Egypt. And I will say the children of Israel's victory in Egypt to be released from there. That was the song of Moses. So then the song of the Lamb would be like for us having a victory over this life to enter into that New Jerusalem. We'll be there. Actually, I see it as we'll be celebrating. Look, I made it. Look, I lived through all that stuff on the earth, and now I'm on the sea of glass. I can see everything that's going on. I know everything that's going on. And one of the parts of that song says, "Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints." At that point in time, we're going to realize that everything Jesus stands for and everything that God has done is just and true. There's none of it that's going to be hidden from us, and we're not going to think those plagues being poured out on the earth, we're not going to think that's bad. We're going to say, that's just and true, O Lord, thou King of saints. Then we skip down and pick up verse 8 there. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. The temple that he sees in the Sea of Glass, the New Jerusalem, is a phrase saying the right to salvation. So the right to salvation is filled, that same word we were talking about a while ago, finished, completed, held in suspension for a time. So the temple salvation is in suspension for a period of time till the 7 last plagues of the 7 angels is poured out on the earth. And that's the thing that John sees here and realizes that those people on the Sea of Glass are in a protective place. The plagues are going to be poured out upon the earth, and then at the end of that time, the temple will be open and salvation will return to the earth once again. And that's what we refer to as the 1,000-year reign of Christ, or the millennium. Interchangeable words there again. Revelation 21. Revelation 21. I bring in a couple of verses to show that it's Jerusalem that we're talking about here. Revelation 21, verse 2. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So John sees New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. Verse 10. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a great and high mountain, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. So we see it's not going to be this earthly Jerusalem restored. It's coming down from God out of heaven. Then verse 18 is how he describes it. And the building and the wall of it was of jasper, and the city was pure gold, like unto clear glass. So we put verse 2 and 10 with 18, and we see it's the New Jerusalem, looking to him like clear glass, pure gold. So if we put those together, then we begin to see this term, New Jerusalem. And verse 10 said Holy Jerusalem. 18, it's the Sea of Glass. Put all those together, and we see that when they use these words, they're talking about the same city. That city coming down from God. Hebrews chapter 11. Another look at a different part here to the New Jerusalem. Hebrews 11. Now we know that Hebrews 11 is the chapter of faith. And so here's what he's talking about with it. Hebrews 11, starting with verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So even when he was on the earth, Abraham knew these prophecies that a city was yet to come, a city that's builder and maker is God. It's got lots of foundations to it, and he looked for that. And it appears that Abraham thought he would run on to that city on the earth. And I can see how he would think that, because he had heard and knew of the stories of the Garden of Eden, how marvelous a place it was, provided by God, and was here on the earth. So he had every right to think, I'm going to run on to that city in my wanderings through this wilderness area. Of course he didn't. It says that he would be heir to it, though. In other words, eventually Abraham will have that salvation in that New Jerusalem also. Verse 16 of that same chapter, let's skip down and get 16. Now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. So they don't find it fleshly here, so they're saying, oh, it's spiritual. And so he says, now they desire a better place, one that's looking for that spiritual city that God has prepared for them. Now think of this way. What did Jesus say when he was about to leave this earth? He said, I go and prepare a place for you, that where I am, there you may be also. In my Father's house are many mansions. I'm preparing some of those for you. 2 phases to this. God prepared the city. Jesus prepares for us a place there individually. Now, whether we're going to live in individual houses or not, we don't know how that's going to work out. This is something that he's just told us. I'm going to go prepare a place for you. Probably assisting God in the preparation of this city, a place that we can be called up to. And this is kind of another thought that we've all been taught all of our life, that at the resurrection we go to heaven. Well, that's not quite right. At the resurrection we go to the New Jerusalem. And actually it won't be in heaven at that time. It will be suspended between heaven and earth. And we'll stay in that suspension period of time during these 7 last plagues. But that's where we'll actually be caught to at that resurrection time. Hebrews 13. Starting with verse 12. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate, or that is outside the city. Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. For we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come. We don't have a continuing city here. Everything on this earth is subject to be destroyed, but we're looking for a continuing city, one that will never be destroyed, one that we can live in forever. But it will be the New Jerusalem, and we'll be in a different body. We'll have that spiritual body with us at that time, so we can live then in a continuous city for a continuous period of time. This comparison here, that Jesus had to suffer or die outside the city, outside the gates of the city, is like a comparison for us today, that we have to spiritually abide outside of the worldly interest. It said, let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp. We can't go there in a physical state. So that's a spiritual state, saying spiritually, emotionally, physically, while we're on this earth, we have to go outside of this camp, or outside of the worldly influence, outside the temptations that the devil would bring on us. We have to reach outside of that by faith to hold on to Jesus and what he stood for there. Maybe even to the suffering point. That's what he had to do. He suffered. He says in verse 13, we're going without the camp, bearing his reproach, meaning you may have to have the same reproach or the same persecution in your life that he had. But he says it's okay, because what you're doing right now is just passing time on this earth. You're just passing time looking for this, verse 14, continuing city. So that's a couple of glimpses that we see here of the New Jerusalem, and how even in the book of Hebrews it was thought of. Back to Revelation chapter 3. Is spoken of in different books, kind of in a different way, we would even say. And here he never called it the New Jerusalem. He called it the continuing city. Sea of glass, holy city, continuing city, was all the same place. Revelation 3, starting with verse 12. Jesus talking here in one of his one of John's letters to the churches. 3:12. Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. And I will write upon him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, which is New Jerusalem, which cometh down out of heaven from my God, and I will write upon him my new name. So, just another verse telling us that out of Jesus' own words, it's called New Jerusalem. It's the city of God, and it's going to come down from God out of heaven. It won't come right down to the earth. It will come down, and we will be changed and caught up into it, and remain in it in that suspended state while these 7 last plagues are being poured out on the earth. It's not a restructured Jerusalem on this earth. It's a new one that will come to us from the Father. Now back to Revelation 21 again. Just to pick up a little bit different thought here on it. Revelation 21. We'll start with verse 11 and see a few things about this. 21:11. Having the glory of God, and her light was like unto a stone most precious, even like the jasper stone, clear as crystal. Notice that word keeps coming in. And had a great wall, high, and had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and the names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. On the east 3 gates, and on the north 3 gates, and on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now that's kind of an important statement there. The 12 apostles of the Lamb. In other words, this had to be the very first 12 apostles that was with Jesus. And if you remember, when Judas betrayed Jesus, committed suicide, then they cast lots to replace him. And the lot came out, and the new person to replace him was Matthias. But what Peter said just before that, he said, no one can fulfill this position except one that's been with us from the beginning. So it was a person that was, so to speak, in the ministry with the other 12, but not called one of the 12. And he would replace Judas, but he had to be an apostle of the Lamb. He had to be one that was there in the beginning. And I stress that because other apostles are later in the Bible. Paul and Barnabas, they were named apostles later in life there. And in studying that one time before, I think that there was 22 other names, or total names, in the New Testament that are called apostles. And we don't usually think of it that way. We think of this original 12 apostles. But after there caused a vacancy there, someone else replaced them. But only those of the original apostles to the Lamb will be written in these foundations. Verse 15. And he that talked with me had a golden reed to measure the city and the gates thereof and the wall thereof. And the city lieth foursquare, and the length is as large as the breadth. And he measured the city with a reed, 12,000 furlongs, and the length and the breadth and the height of it are equal. What does that tell us? It tells us the New Jerusalem was a cube. Length and the breadth and the height, they're all the equal length. So he says it's a cube. And he measured the wall thereof 144 cubits, according to the measure of a man, that is, of the angel. Now, evidently it looks like then we have the city with a wall around it, and the wall had this extra measurement to it. Now, I'll say to you that are hearing this on the CD, you can't see me draw this, but I've got a little drawing here just to show a point. They're supposed to be square, and it said it's 1,500 miles, 12,000 furlongs, about 1,500 miles. In that day and time, when they measured something, they measured the total length. It would be like as if it was round. And you said this round city is 1,500 miles. Well, you would measure completely around it. Well, that's actually what they did in that day and time also. So when he measures the New Jerusalem here, he measures all the way around it. We'll say he started that corner and went all the way around, and it was 1,500 miles. And we actually found this in a Jewish history book, because we always assumed it was 1,500 miles on each side. Then we find this Jewish history book that says, no, everything was measured in its completeness. So that makes it 375 miles on each side, making the total of the 1,500 miles all the way around it. Now that is brought out in that wording there that says, it lieth foursquare. So when it lieth foursquare, then he's telling them it's not round, and it's not a rectangle, and it's not a triangle. It lieth foursquare. In other words, it's a square. And when they measured it, it was 375 miles actually on each side. So we begin to see then again a little bit about this. A further description, we'll just pick up in verse 21. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Every several gate was 1 pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. So there we have that phrase again, that it's a sea of glass. It's a transparent glass. That's what it would be like to look at it from below. You could see all the way through the street and see what was there in it. So the New Jerusalem, the sea of glass, being that same thing. And one last text here, Revelation 22, verse 14. Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. That's the city that we look to go to. That's the city that we want to enter into. That's the sea of glass that we want to stand on and sing that song of the Lamb, like we read about in our first text there. So we just see from this a few characteristics of the New Jerusalem, mainly that it is a sea of glass. If we had time to go into all of that description that we just read from chapter 11 on, and even see how a total gate was 1 perfect pearl. How tall would that gate be? Well, maybe as tall as that wall, which was 144 cubits in height. So this would be a beautiful place and a big place, one that we can't comprehend, one that we can only imagine what it may have looked like, and we look forward to seeing it, look forward to being there. And that last verse told us when we want to enter into that city, keep the commandments of God. Puts it out pretty simple to us. Let's stand for our closing prayer.